Hi, I'm Cynthia Kurtz, one of the creators of NarraFirma. This video is a quick overview of what it's like to use NarraFirma. Let's get started. This is the home page of NarraFirma. It's an application that runs on the web on either WordPress or Node.js. The 6 orange buttons you see here correspond to the 6 phases of participatory narrative inquiry, or PNI. If you don't know what PNI is, I suggest you take a quick look at workingwithstories.org and then come back. In the planning phase of PNI, you make decisions about how you will carry out your project. In NarraFirma, each phase has a dashboard page like this one, where you can navigate to the pages in that section. You can also write reminders to yourself on any page in the application. Those reminders show up here. Here, the user is entering some basic facts about their project. One of the reasons to use NarraFirma is to have a record of what you did in your project, so you can look back on it when you're ready for your next project. Here, the user is thinking about the groups of people they will be asking to tell stories. Sometimes there will be only one group, but often you will be approaching different groups with different characteristics and needs. After you describe your groups, NarraFirma makes a series of recommendations about how best to design your project. In the collection phase of PNI, as you might expect, you collect stories. This part of the software helps you write questions, design the conversations you will have, and review the stories you have collected. There are many ways to collect stories. You can talk to people one at a time or in groups. You can talk to people in person, on the phone, through email, over the web. You can not talk to people and simply listen as they talk to each other. NarraFirma helps you decide how to collect stories based on your previous descriptions of participant groups. The recommendations you see here are based on my own experiences doing PNI projects. In participatory narrative inquiry, we usually get people started telling stories by asking them questions that help them recall their experiences, or as I like to call it, questions whose answers are stories. Here, the NarraFirma user is designing questions that will elicit stories. Asking someone questions about a story they just told can help you understand their point of view. That's why people often ask each other questions about stories they have just told in conversation. Participatory narrative inquiry is an amplification of this natural social process. You could say that PNI is a story-sharing conversation, scaled up to the organizational or community level. In this screenshot, the NarraFirma user is reviewing questions they will be asking people about their stories. In PNI projects, we also ask people direct questions about themselves. The juxtaposition of direct questioning through about you questions and indirect questioning through about the story you just told questions helps your community or organization explore a topic more fully. In this screenshot, the NarraFirma user is copying a question about participants from one of the templates that come with the software. We call the combination of eliciting questions, questions about stories, and questions about participants a story form. Story forms can be used in interviews, in group sessions, or on web forms. In NarraFirma, you can customize the story form to look the way you want it to. Stories can be entered into NarraFirma in any of 3 ways: through a web survey that participants take, through a data entry form, or by being imported from a CSV spreadsheet file. In this screenshot, somebody is entering stories collected offline into NarraFirma. By the way, NarraFirma does not yet have the ability to handle audio or video or image data with the stories. At this point, we're assuming that stories collected in audio form will be transcribed into text. Here's what the story form looks like when a project participant is telling stories through a web form. You can change many things about the appearance of the web form using the options available in NarraFirma. In this screenshot, the NarraFirma user is adding extra questions, or annotations, to be answered by a researcher or project helper. These are the kind of things that would be called coding in qualitative or narrative analysis, like tone of voice or word choices. In this case, the researcher wants to record how many people were mentioned in each story, because they think there might be a useful pattern there. Here the user is looking at the stories they've collected, and they're filtering the stories by the questions they asked. For example, they're looking only at the 9 stories told by people younger than 35 who said that the main character in their story needed to be heard. Here the user is editing a collected story. NarraFirma includes this option so you can anonymize stories, for example, by removing mentions of people's names. This is also how you answer annotation questions you created, such as how many people were involved in this story. Catalysis is an optional phase of PNI in which people look for patterns in the stories and answers to questions. I call this phase catalysis because its purpose is to catalyze thought and discussion. NarraFirma generates all the patterns, that is, the graphs and statistical tests, that it can, based on the data you collected. You can sort your patterns by statistical significance, so you can see at a glance the strongest trends in your data. In this screenshot, which is of the same page as before but scrolled down, the NarraFirma user has selected a pattern, is looking at its graph, and has selected some of the stories shown on the graph. They can see the list of stories they have selected below the graph. In this screenshot, on the same page still, the user is writing 2 competing interpretations of the same pattern they see in the data. This is one of the rules of narrative catalysis in PNI. Instead of writing conclusions or findings, we create deliberate disagreements about what the patterns we see in the data might mean. Why do we do this? Because PNI is not science. It's a conversation. The point of narrative catalysis is not to prove anything. It's to generate a rich set of materials people can use in the sense-making phase of PNI. At this point in the catalysis process, the user has gone through all the graphs generated by NarraFirma, and they have written many observations and interpretations based on those graphs. Here I'm saying user, but that word could refer to one person, or it could refer to a group of people working together. In this screenshot, the user is clustering their interpretations to produce a smaller number of perspectives, which will become the headings of their catalysis report. And here is a catalysis report generated by NarraFirma. It's typically used during a sense-making session, along with the collected stories, to stimulate discussion in groups. You can change how the report looks by manipulating its CSS classes. The sense-making phase of PNI typically takes place in a workshop setting, with a group of people who make sense of stories and patterns together. They may or may not work with a catalysis report, but they always work with stories. Here the NarraFirma user is planning a sense-making session. They have set up a series of activities, and they can print an agenda to take with them to the session. NarraFirma includes a list of exercise templates you can copy into your plan for your sense-making session. Here the user has used NarraFirma to generate story cards to be used in a sense-making session. Participants in the session will manipulate these cards as they work with the stories printed on them. You can choose which questions to include in your story cards and what they should look like. Now the user is recording what happened during a sense-making session, including any conclusions that people came to, ideas that were discussed, and reflections on what the facilitator learned from the session. The intervention phase of PNI is about changing the stories people tell. NarraFirma follows the ideas for narrative interventions that are described in the book Working with Stories. Some example interventions are setting up a story sharing space, creating a narrative suggestion box, and building a narrative learning resource. NarraFirma helps you choose, plan, and record interventions. On this screen, the NarraFirma user is describing how the project played out for each of their participant groups. This helps NarraFirma suggest interventions that might be helpful to each group. Not shown here are screens where you can plan interventions and record what happened when you carried them out. In the return phase of PNI, the project comes to an end and the stories return to the community. NarraFirma helps you with several concluding tasks that help you see the project to a successful conclusion and learn from what happened. On this screen, you can record feedback you got from people about the project. Why would you want to record feedback? For 3 reasons: to evaluate the project, to help people make sense of what happened, and to improve your own PNI practice. On this screen, there is a place to reflect on the project. These reflections will prove valuable in the future when you've forgotten the details of what happened. And that's a quick look at NarraFirma. To play with the project you saw in these screenshots, visit narrafirma.com and click Try It. To learn more about participatory narrative inquiry, visit workingwithstories.org, where you'll find my textbook on how to do PNI. Also, you can send me an email at cfkurtz@cfkurtz.com. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about NarraFirma and PNI. Thank you for watching.